The second you open this video, something has already occurred that most people misunderstand. Not because an event has been triggered, not because information has arrived, but because a threshold has already been crossed. Opening this is not the cause. It is the evidence. Evidence that coherence has already reached the level required for contact to become possible. Contact does not initiate itself. It does not arrive uninvited. It becomes perceivable only when internal noise drops below a certain point. And that has already happened here. Contact is not an interaction. It is a phase of perception. A state where awareness becomes coherent enough to register the field without distortion. When thought, emotion, identity, and nervous system are no longer pulling in opposing directions, perception stabilizes. The field does not change. You do. What was previously invisible due to fragmentation becomes obvious through clarity. This is why contact always feels sudden, yet inevitable. It was never absent. It was inaccessible. The act of opening this video signals agreement within you. Not agreement in belief, but agreement in state. Curiosity without urgency. Attention without grasping. Presence without demand. These are markers of coherence. In incoherence, attention scatters, emotion spikes or collapses, and identity seeks control. In that state, perception cannot register continuity. It can only detect threat, lack, or stimulation. But when coherence stabilizes, perception widens. The field becomes apparent not as something external, but as the intelligence already organizing experience. This is why nothing is being done here. No method is required. No effort is useful. Effort implies resistance. Resistance implies fragmentation. Fragmentation collapses coherence. Contact is allowed, not achieved. It emerges when the system stops trying to get somewhere else. This is the law. The moment you are no longer reaching, perception settles. And when perception settles, the field becomes obvious. Notice that nothing dramatic is required for this phase to be present. Contact is often quiet. Ordinary. Unremarkable. It does not announce itself because it is not an arrival. It is the absence of interference. Like static clearing from a signal that was always broadcasting. When coherence is present, meaning feels inherent rather than constructed. Reality feels responsive, not because it changed, but because distortion dropped away. This is why attempting to hold the experience makes it vanish. The moment you think about maintaining it, identity contracts. Time enters. Control activates. Coherence drops. Contact appears to leave. But nothing left. Perception became noisy again. The simplicity of contact cannot survive inspection. It exists only in allowance. So understand this clearly. The second you opened this, contact was already possible. Not because of the video. Because of the state that led you here. The coherence that allowed this moment is the same coherence that allows the field to be perceived. Nothing more is required. Nothing else is coming. Recognition is the shift. This changes everything. If you are aligned with this frequency, subscribe and remain within it. Coherence is not a technique and it is not a mindset. It is a condition. A state of internal agreement that either exists or does not. When coherence is present, contact becomes possible. When it is absent, contact cannot be perceived, no matter how much effort is applied. This is not a judgment. It is a structural fact about perception. Internal agreement means that attention is not split, emotion is not spiking or collapsing, identity is not fragmenting, and the nervous system is not signaling threat or urgency. These elements do not need to be perfected. They only need to stop contradicting each other. The moment they stop pulling in different directions, coherence stabilizes. And when coherence stabilizes, perception gains enough resolution to register continuity in the field. Fragmented states feel active, but they are actually noisy. In fragmentation, attention jumps, emotion reacts, identity seeks control, and the body braces. This creates interference. Not metaphorically, but functionally. Perception in this state is narrow and distorted. It can only process contrast, danger, or lack. Subtle continuity cannot be detected here. Not because it is absent, but because the system is too disordered to perceive it. This is why contact cannot be accessed through wanting. Wanting implies lack. Lack implies separation. Separation implies incoherence. The system that is reaching is the same system that is fragmenting itself. No amount of intention can override that. Contact is not blocked by distance. It is blocked by internal disagreement. Coherence does not require calm thoughts or positive emotion. It requires congruence. You can be quiet or neutral. You can even be uncertain. What matters is that the system is not fighting itself. When emotion, attention, identity, and the nervous system align in the same direction, even gently, coherence is present. And that alignment opens access. Notice how coherence feels. It does not feel dramatic. It feels simple. There is less commentary. Less urgency. Less need to define what is happening. This simplicity is not emptiness. It is bandwidth. When the system is no longer consumed by internal correction, perception widens. The field becomes noticeable not as something extraordinary, but as something obvious that was previously obscured. This is why fragmented states often chase intensity. Intensity creates temporary focus, but it does not create coherence. In fact, it usually destabilizes it further. Coherence is not sharpened by force. It is stabilized by allowing the system to settle into agreement. Not by pushing emotion down, but by stopping the internal tug-of-war. Contact requires coherence because contact is subtle. Not weak, but subtle. It exists at the level of continuity, pattern, and responsiveness. These are not loud signals. They are structural ones. Only a coherent system can register structure without mistaking it for noise. So understand this clearly. Coherence is not something you generate to reach contact. It is the condition that allows contact to be perceptible at all. When coherence is absent, contact is inaccessible. When coherence is present, contact requires no effort. It is already there, waiting for interference to stop. Contact has been misunderstood because it has been described as something that arrives. An event. A message. A signal crossing a distance. But contact is not incoming. Nothing is sent. Nothing arrives. Contact is what perception registers when it becomes coherent enough to stop misinterpreting reality as fragmented. It is not a transmission. It is a resolution change. When perception is unstable, reality appears disjointed. Cause and effect feel random. Meaning feels imposed rather than inherent. The world appears external, unresponsive, or indifferent. This is not because the field lacks order. It is because perception lacks coherence. Fragmented perception cannot register continuity. It sees pieces, not patterns. Noise, not structure. Contact occurs when this changes. Not because something new enters awareness, but because awareness becomes steady enough to detect what was always present. Perception stops scanning for events and begins registering relationship. The field becomes noticeable as continuous, responsive, and intelligent. Not personal. Not communicative. Responsive in the sense that coherence reveals pattern. This is why contact often feels like being met, even though nothing is meeting you. What you are sensing is not an external intelligence responding to you, but an internal clarity that allows intelligence to be recognized everywhere. When distortion drops, responsiveness becomes obvious. Reality feels ordered because it always was. The shift happens in perception, not in the field. Messages are a misinterpretation. When coherence increases, insight appears. Pattern recognition sharpens. Meaning emerges without effort. The mind, accustomed to narratives, interprets this as something being delivered. But nothing was delivered. The system simply gained access to information that was previously filtered out by noise. Entities are another misinterpretation. When separation softens, awareness no longer feels isolated. The mind tries to explain this by imagining an other. But contact does not require an other. It requires the absence of internal division. When division drops, continuity is felt. That continuity can feel vast, intimate, or intelligent, but it is not separate. Stabilized perception is the key distinction. Brief coherence can create flashes of insight, moments of clarity, or sudden understanding. But when coherence holds, contact stabilizes. The field no longer appears and disappears. It becomes the background. Ordinary. Reliable. Not exciting, but steady. This is why stabilized contact is often mistaken for losing something. The drama fades, but access remains. This also explains why chasing signs breaks contact. Looking for confirmation turns perception outward into seeking mode. Seeking introduces time, lack, and control. Control fractures coherence. Fractured coherence collapses stabilized perception. Contact seems to vanish, not because it withdrew, but because perception destabilized. So contact is not something that happens to you. It is something that becomes apparent when perception is no longer fighting itself. It is the natural state of coherent awareness. Continuous. Responsive. Quietly intelligent. Not an event to wait for, but a clarity to stop interrupting. Once this is understood, the search ends. Not because answers were found, but because the question dissolves. Contact was never missing. Perception was simply too fragmented to notice. Before coherence can be understood structurally, emotion must be understood functionally. Emotion is not decoration on experience. It is not something to be expressed or suppressed. Emotion is a regulator. It determines whether perception has enough bandwidth to access contact or whether that bandwidth collapses into noise. This is the mechanical layer most people miss. Emotion governs coherence by shaping the internal environment in which perception operates. When emotion is extreme, either elevated or suppressed, it narrows perception. Attention locks onto sensation, story, or reaction. Identity tightens around meaning. The nervous system shifts toward activation or shutdown. In these states, perception loses resolution. It becomes coarse. Contact cannot be registered here, not because it is gone, but because the signal is overwhelmed. Calm emotion expands bandwidth. Not excitement. Not bliss. Calm. Emotional neutrality allows attention to spread rather than spike. It allows perception to register multiple layers at once without collapsing into fixation. This widening is what allows the field to become perceptible as continuous rather than fragmented. This is why emotional chasing blocks access. Chasing a feeling, even a positive one, introduces instability. It creates oscillation. Oscillation fractures coherence. Contact may flash briefly during emotional highs, but it cannot stabilize there. The system is too volatile. High emotion consumes bandwidth instead of freeing it. Low emotion can also block access. Emotional suppression dulls perception. It reduces sensitivity. The field cannot be registered because perception is dimmed. Coherence requires neither emotional inflation nor emotional numbing. It requires emotional agreement. A steady signal. Emotion becomes problematic only when it dominates the system. When emotion is allowed to exist without being amplified or resisted, it regulates itself. This self-regulation restores coherence. Perception widens naturally. Contact becomes accessible without effort. This is why contact often appears during emotionally quiet moments. Not joyful, not dramatic, just settled. In these moments, emotion is present but not leading. Attention is not hijacked. Identity is not reacting. The nervous system is not bracing. Bandwidth opens. The field becomes noticeable. Emotion is guidance, but not in the way most people think. It does not guide by instruction. It guides by regulation. Expansion signals coherence. Contraction signals fragmentation. These signals are not moral. They are informational. They tell you whether perception is open enough to access continuity. Trying to use emotion to force contact reverses its function. Emotion becomes noise instead of regulation. This is why emotional rituals, affirmations charged with intensity, or dramatic visualization often produce exhaustion rather than clarity. They overload the system. Bandwidth collapses. Emotion stabilizes coherence when it is allowed to be present without interpretation. Without escalation. Without suppression. In that allowance, emotion finds its own equilibrium. That equilibrium is what opens perceptual access. So understand this precisely. Emotion does not create contact. Emotion regulates whether contact can be perceived. When emotion is calm and integrated, bandwidth expands. When emotion spikes or collapses, bandwidth contracts. Coherence lives in the middle. And contact becomes accessible only there. Control is often mistaken for stability, but it is the primary reason coherence collapses before contact can stabilize. Control feels active, responsible, and intentional, yet structurally it fragments the system. The moment control is introduced, attention narrows, identity contracts, emotion tightens, and the nervous system shifts into management mode. These elements stop agreeing with each other. Coherence breaks. Control always implies a problem to solve or a state to reach. That implication alone introduces separation. There is a you here and something else there. Time enters the system. Evaluation begins. This immediately pulls perception out of the present and into correction. Contact cannot stabilize in that state because contact exists only when perception is settled, not when it is adjusting itself. Effort-based connection attempts fail for this reason. The act of trying to connect signals that connection is not present. That signal is incoherent. It instructs the system to search, reach, and monitor. Monitoring requires constant reference to past and future. This keeps perception oscillating. Oscillation prevents stabilization. Contact may flicker, but it cannot hold. Control fragments coherence by dividing the system into roles. One part observes. Another part evaluates. Another part tries to change what is observed. This internal division creates noise. Even if the intention is calm or spiritual, the structure is still fragmented. The system is no longer in agreement. It is managing itself. And managed systems cannot perceive subtle continuity. This is why contact often appears when control drops unexpectedly. During moments of surrender, exhaustion, awe, or simple presence, the internal manager steps aside. Attention stops directing. Identity stops correcting. The nervous system relaxes. Coherence returns. Contact becomes obvious, not because something arrived, but because interference stopped. Trying to hold contact is another form of control. The moment the mind says, "This is it," or "Don't lose this," identity tightens around the experience. Time re-enters. Evaluation begins. The system starts tracking itself. Coherence breaks. Contact seems to disappear. This creates the illusion that contact is fragile or fleeting. It is not. It is control-sensitive. Allowing is not passivity. It is structural intelligence. Allowing means not interfering with the natural tendency of the system to settle into agreement when left alone. When attention is not forced, emotion is not resisted, identity is not defended, and the nervous system is not braced, coherence stabilizes by itself. This is not a practice. It is a removal of obstruction. Control feels necessary because it promises security. But the security it offers is false. It stabilizes behavior while destabilizing perception. Contact does not require behavioral control. It requires perceptual clarity. And clarity emerges only when the system is not trying to shape itself. So understand this precisely. Control does not refine contact. It prevents it. Effort does not stabilize coherence. It fractures it. The system does not need to be guided into contact. It needs to be left alone long enough for agreement to return. When that happens, contact stabilizes naturally, quietly, without effort. This is the reversal most people miss. The nervous system is not separate from coherence. It is the interface through which coherence becomes perceivable and sustainable. You do not access contact through thought or belief. You access it through safety. And safety is not conceptual. It is physiological. If the nervous system is signaling threat, urgency, or vigilance, coherence cannot hold long enough for contact to stabilize. This is because perception follows regulation. A regulated nervous system allows attention to remain unified. It allows emotion to settle into a narrow, stable range. It allows identity to soften rather than contract. When the body feels safe, perception widens. When the body does not, perception narrows. This is not psychological theory. It is structural reality. In an activated nervous system, the field cannot be registered as continuous. Everything is scanned for danger, relevance, or utility. Subtle pattern disappears. Continuity feels invisible. In this state, even moments of insight are brief. Contact flickers, then collapses, because the system cannot remain open without feeling threatened. This is why sustained contact is impossible in chronic tension. Safety does not mean comfort or pleasure. It means the absence of immediate threat. A nervous system can be neutral and still safe. It can even be tired and still safe. What matters is that it is not bracing. Bracing fragments coherence. When the body braces, attention splits between now and anticipation. Identity contracts into self-protection. Emotion sharpens. Coherence breaks. Regulation restores access. Regulation is not control. It is the natural settling of the system when it is not being pushed or resisted. Softening the breath, releasing unnecessary tension, allowing attention to rest instead of aim, these are not techniques to reach contact. They are ways of removing interference so coherence can return. When coherence returns, contact becomes stable. This is why contact often appears during moments of stillness, quiet presence, or even boredom. The nervous system is not being stimulated or threatened. It downshifts. In that downshift, perception opens. The field becomes noticeable, not as something dramatic, but as a background intelligence that was always there. The body allowed perception to widen. It is also why contact collapses during overanalysis. Analysis activates monitoring. Monitoring activates control. Control activates vigilance. Vigilance signals threat. Threat collapses regulation. The loop is immediate. Contact does not leave. Access closes. The nervous system does not need to understand contact. It needs to feel safe enough to allow perception to stabilize. This is why declarations matter. When you name readiness without force, the body listens. The system orients. Identity relaxes. Coherence holds longer. If this recognition is landing, comment with the words, "I am ready," to anchor this timeline. Understand this clearly. The nervous system is not an obstacle to contact. It is the gateway. Safety is not optional. Regulation is not secondary. Coherence cannot be sustained in a system that is bracing against itself. When the body feels safe enough to stop managing reality, perception stabilizes. And when perception stabilizes, contact holds effortlessly. Stabilization changes the orientation entirely. Up to this point, contact may have appeared as something brief, delicate, or easily disrupted. But stabilization is not about making contact stronger. It is about removing what distorts it. This is where most misunderstand. They assume contact deepens through intensity, through heightened emotion, through amplified sensation. In reality, intensity destabilizes coherence. Clarity is what allows contact to hold. Intensity sharpens focus, but it also narrows perception. It excites the nervous system, tightens identity, and pulls attention toward peak and away from continuity. Intensity creates contrast, not stability. It can produce flashes of insight or dramatic sensations, but those states oscillate. They rise and fall. Contact does not stabilize in oscillation. It stabilizes in stillness. Clarity feels almost disappointing to a mind trained to seek stimulation. It is quiet, ordinary, neutral. There is no signal announcing that something important is happening. And yet, this ordinariness is the signature of stability. When coherence is present without effort, perception stops chasing peaks. The field becomes the background rather than the event. That is stabilization. Clarity means that perception is no longer trying to interpret or enhance what is being noticed. There is less commentary, less labeling, less anticipation. The system is not asking what this is or where it is going. It is simply registering what is already here. This non-interference allows contact to remain continuous rather than episodic. Heightened states collapse for a simple reason. They require maintenance. They depend on sustaining a particular emotional charge or attentional focus. The moment that charge fades, the state disappears. Contact then appears lost. This creates a cycle of chasing, which reintroduces effort, which breaks coherence. Clarity requires no maintenance. It is self-sustaining because it is not constructed. Ordinariness is not a downgrade. It is an upgrade in resolution. When contact stabilizes, it no longer feels special. It feels integrated. Like a constant hum rather than a burst of sound. This is why people often misinterpret stabilization as losing something. The excitement fades, but access remains. The drama leaves, but the field stays. This is also why contact stabilizes in simple moments. Sitting quietly. Walking without urgency. Listening without waiting to respond. In these moments, clarity is high because interference is low. The system is not performing. It is not evaluating. It is not reaching. Coherence holds. Contact becomes steady. Trying to recreate a heightened experience breaks this stability. Memory introduces time. Time introduces comparison. Comparison introduces lack. Lack introduces effort. Effort fractures coherence. The chain is immediate. Stabilization cannot coexist with reenactment. It exists only in present clarity. So understand this precisely. Contact does not stabilize by becoming more intense. It stabilizes by becoming more clear. Clear perception is calm perception. Calm perception is coherent perception. And coherent perception does not need to announce itself. It simply remains. When clarity is allowed to be enough, contact stops flickering. It stops arriving and leaving. It becomes the baseline. Quiet. Ordinary. Continuous. This is not the loss of contact. It is the maturation of it. Contrast is not the end of contact. It is the point where coherence is measured. When fluctuation appears, the mind often assumes something has been lost. Attention turns toward diagnosis. Identity tightens. Control returns. In that moment, coherence weakens, not because contrast appeared, but because contrast was misunderstood. Contact does not disappear when contrast arises. Contact is not fragile. What shifts is the system's response to contrast. If contrast is resisted, coherence fragments. If contrast is allowed, coherence reveals its strength. Contrast is feedback, not failure. Fluctuation is inevitable because coherence is not rigidity. It is agreement. Agreement can be tested. When attention wavers, when emotion shifts, when energy dips or sharpens, these are not signs of disconnection. They are signals showing how stable internal agreement actually is. A coherent system can move without collapsing. An incoherent one breaks at the first change. Most people lose access to contact not during intensity, but during subtle contrast. A moment of doubt. A dip in clarity. A thought asking whether this is still happening. That single question introduces time and evaluation. Evaluation activates control. Control fractures coherence. Contact seems to end, but it was the reaction that closed access, not the contrast itself. Contrast becomes destructive only when it is interpreted as a problem. The moment the system tries to correct the fluctuation, coherence is compromised. Allowing contrast without response keeps the system unified. Attention stays present. Identity does not contract. The nervous system does not brace. Coherence holds. This is why advanced stability feels unbothered. Not because nothing changes, but because change no longer triggers correction. Fluctuation passes through without being amplified. Contact remains in the background, steady and continuous, because perception is no longer trying to manage itself. Contrast sharpens coherence by revealing where interference still exists. It shows which movements destabilize agreement and which do not. This information is not meant to be acted on. It is meant to be seen. Seeing without fixing preserves coherence. Fixing introduces fragmentation. There is a difference between contrast and collapse. Collapse occurs only when contrast is met with resistance. When resistance appears, the system tightens, and coherence drops. When contrast is met with neutrality, the system remains open, and coherence adapts. Contact continues uninterrupted. This is why contact often feels more stable after contrast. Each unreacted fluctuation increases confidence in the system's capacity to hold. The need to protect the state dissolves. Identity relaxes. Coherence deepens not by force, but by trust. So understand this clearly. Contrast does not remove access. Reaction does. Fluctuation does not end contact. Misinterpretation does. When contrast is allowed to pass without commentary, coherence reveals itself as resilient rather than delicate. Contact is not a static state to defend. It is a continuous phase that accommodates movement. The more this is recognized, the less effort is applied. And the less effort is applied, the more stable coherence becomes. Presence is not a practice. It is the condition that exists when coherence is uninterrupted. Contact cannot exist outside of presence because contact is not something added to experience. It is what perception registers when nothing is pulling attention away from what is already here. The moment attention leaves the present, coherence fragments. And when coherence fragments, contact becomes inaccessible. Presence means that attention, emotion, identity, and the nervous system are oriented to the same moment. Not frozen. Not focused with effort. Simply not split across time. In presence, perception is unified. There is no reference point outside of now. This unity is coherence itself. And coherence is the only condition in which contact can be perceived. Time orientation disrupts this immediately. When attention moves into the past, perception collapses into memory. When it moves into the future, perception collapses into anticipation. Both require comparison. Comparison requires evaluation. Evaluation activates control. Control fragments coherence. The sequence is automatic. Contact does not disappear because time exists. It disappears because perception is no longer stable. Even subtle time references are enough to disrupt access. Wondering whether contact will continue. Checking if it is deeper than before. Measuring progress. These actions seem harmless, but they split attention. Part of perception stays here, part moves elsewhere. That split is incoherence. Contact cannot exist in a divided system. Presence does not mean trying to stay in the moment. Trying implies effort. Effort introduces resistance. Resistance introduces fragmentation. Presence is what remains when effort drops. It is the natural state of a system that is not correcting itself. When there is no need to go anywhere else, perception settles here by default. This is why contact often feels timeless. Not eternal, but free of reference. The sense of duration softens. There is no urge to mark the moment or extract meaning from it. The system is not orienting around before or after. It is simply registering continuity. That continuity is the field being perceived without interference. When presence is stable, contact does not need to be named. Naming introduces distance. Distance introduces time. Time introduces separation. Presence does not announce itself. It is quiet because it is complete. There is nothing to add and nothing to remove. This is also why presence cannot be maintained through discipline. Discipline implies future reward. Future reward implies lack now. Lack now fractures coherence. Presence collapses. The paradox is simple. The more you try to stay present, the more you leave it. The less you interfere, the more it holds. Contact exists only where there is no elsewhere. No later. No earlier. No comparison. No evaluation. Just unified perception. This does not mean nothing happens. It means nothing is pulled out of alignment while it happens. So understand this precisely. Presence is not a tool to access contact. Presence is coherence itself. And coherence is the condition that allows contact to be perceived at all. When attention rests here without effort, contact does not come and go. It simply remains, because there is nowhere else for perception to be. Before timelines can be understood, they must be removed from the idea of movement. A timeline is not something you enter, progress along, or shift into. There is no traveling involved. A timeline is a stabilized perceptual state. It is the way reality appears when coherence holds consistently. Change the coherence, and the timeline changes automatically, without effort. Timelines are sustained, not chosen. They persist only as long as the perceptual conditions that define them remain intact. This is why timelines feel solid when coherence is stable and feel unstable when coherence fluctuates. The world does not reorganize itself. Perception reorganizes, and reality reflects that organization. Coherent perception registers continuity. Cause and effect feel aligned. Events feel connected rather than random. The future feels implicit rather than uncertain. This experience is what people call a timeline. It is not a path unfolding. It is a state being held. When coherence drops, that state cannot be sustained. The sense of trajectory collapses, and reality feels chaotic or stalled. This is why effort cannot move you into a new timeline. Effort introduces strain. Strain fractures coherence. Fractured coherence destabilizes perception. The timeline you were attempting to reach dissolves before it can be held. Wanting a different outcome without changing coherence only intensifies the existing state. Timelines change when perception changes. Not suddenly through force, but naturally through stabilization. When attention, emotion, identity, and the nervous system remain in agreement over time, perception stops oscillating. That non-oscillation is what holds a timeline in place. It is not maintained consciously. It is maintained structurally. This also explains why timelines collapse during internal conflict. When identity pulls in multiple directions, when emotion contradicts intention, when the nervous system signals urgency, perception loses consistency. Without consistency, the state cannot persist. The timeline dissolves, not because something went wrong, but because the conditions required to sustain it are no longer present. A coherent timeline feels effortless. Not easy, but unforced. Actions feel obvious. Decisions feel aligned. There is less second-guessing because perception is not fragmented. This clarity is not guidance arriving from elsewhere. It is perception no longer interfering with itself. The field appears responsive because coherence allows pattern to be seen. This is why waiting for signs keeps timelines unstable. Looking for confirmation splits attention between now and later. That split weakens coherence. The timeline wavers. When confirmation is no longer required, perception settles. The state holds. Reality reflects that stability. Timelines are not selected by thought. They are sustained by consistency of state. You do not need to imagine a future to enter it. You need to stop destabilizing the present. When coherence holds now, the perceptual state extends naturally. That extension is experienced as a timeline. So understand this clearly. Timelines are not destinations. They are stabilized perceptions. They persist only while coherence remains intact. When coherence changes, timelines shift automatically. There is no movement required. There is only agreement to maintain. Identity is not a collection of traits, beliefs, or behaviors. Those change easily. Identity, in the context of coherence, is vibrational consistency. It is the pattern that remains when reactions settle and effort drops. This consistency is what allows coherence to persist across time, and it is what stabilizes timelines without conscious maintenance. Most people attempt to change timelines by modifying behavior or beliefs. This creates friction because behavior is downstream. Beliefs are unstable. Neither can hold coherence on their own. Identity, however, is prior. It is the sense of what is normal, expected, and inevitable. When identity is coherent, perception remains consistent. When perception remains consistent, the timeline holds. Identity stabilizes coherence not through effort, but through recognition. Recognition means seeing what is already true rather than trying to become something else. The moment identity is treated as something to fix or improve, it fractures. Self-modification implies lack. Lack implies instability. Instability collapses coherence. The attempt to change identity undermines the very consistency required to hold a new timeline. Recognition works differently. When identity is recognized rather than constructed, it relaxes. There is no strain in holding it. It does not require vigilance. It does not need to be defended. This relaxation allows coherence to extend naturally over time. The system is no longer correcting itself. It is simply expressing what it already knows itself to be. This is why identity shifts often feel subtle. There is no announcement. No dramatic decision. Just a quiet sense that certain reactions no longer fit. Certain patterns fall away without resistance. This is not loss. It is alignment. The vibrational pattern changes, and coherence reorganizes around it. The timeline adjusts automatically. Identity holds coherence by setting the baseline of expectation. Not conscious expectation, but structural expectation. What you assume will happen without thinking about it. What feels normal? What feels inevitable? These assumptions are not chosen. They emerge from identity. When identity stabilizes, these assumptions stop fluctuating. Perception becomes steady. The timeline holds. This is also why attempting to fake a new identity fails. Performing a version of yourself requires effort. Effort requires monitoring. Monitoring introduces fragmentation. Fragmentation destabilizes coherence. The system cannot hold a timeline that requires constant correction. Only recognized identity sustains itself without maintenance. Identity is not static. It evolves. But it evolves through integration, not force. When coherence increases, identity naturally refines. Certain self-concepts dissolve because they are no longer necessary. Others become more pronounced because they are structurally aligned. This refinement is effortless because it is not imposed. Across time, identity acts as the container that coherence rests within. Without a stable container, coherence leaks. With recognition-based identity, coherence remains intact. This is what allows timelines to feel continuous rather than episodic. The sense of direction stabilizes not because the future is controlled, but because perception is no longer contradicting itself. So understand this precisely. Identity does not create coherence through effort. It holds coherence through consistency. And consistency arises through recognition, not modification. When identity is allowed to be what it already is, coherence stabilizes across time, and timelines sustain themselves without force. The field does not respond to wanting. Wanting is a signal of incoherence. It implies that something is missing, elsewhere, or not yet accessible. That implication fragments perception and destabilizes identity. The field does not move toward fragmentation. It mirrors coherence. This is why effort-based manifestation fails and why stable timelines never respond to desire alone. The field is passive, not inert. Passive means it does not initiate, pursue, or correct. It reflects. It organizes experience according to the coherence that is present. When coherence is stable, the field appears responsive. When coherence fluctuates, the field appears inconsistent. Nothing is being decided externally. The mirror is simply accurate. Desire is unstable because it is time-oriented. It points toward a future state that is not yet here. That orientation splits attention. Part of perception is here, part is elsewhere. That split is incoherence. The field reflects that split as delay, inconsistency, or lack. Not as punishment, but as structure. Coherent identity, on the other hand, is present-oriented. It does not reach. It assumes. What feels assumed does not require confirmation. This assumption is not intellectual. It is structural. It is the baseline state of the system. When identity holds coherence without effort, the field reflects that stability as continuity in experience. This is why the field often responds when you stop asking. Asking keeps identity in a state of not having. Not having cannot be mirrored as having. When the system stops broadcasting need and starts resting in coherence, the mirror changes automatically. The reflection follows the state, not the request. Effort does not impress the field. Effort destabilizes perception. Monitoring progress, checking results, or adjusting behavior to force an outcome all introduce control. Control fractures coherence. The field reflects that fracture as resistance or unpredictability. This creates the illusion that the field is withholding. It is not. It is mirroring. Coherent identity does not try to convince the field. It does not signal urgency. It does not demand movement. It holds a consistent state and allows reflection to organize around it. This is why subtle shifts often produce disproportionate changes. The coherence threshold was crossed, and the mirror updated. This also explains why conflicting desires produce chaotic results. When identity broadcasts mixed signals, the mirror reflects inconsistency. The field appears random because coherence is unstable. When identity resolves into agreement, the mirror becomes orderly. The field appears intelligent because perception is no longer interfering. Nothing needs to be sent to the field. There is no communication required. The field already contains all possibilities. Coherence determines which configurations become visible and sustained. Wanting selects nothing. Coherence selects everything. So understand this clearly. The field does not answer requests. It reflects states. It does not respond to effort. It mirrors coherence. When identity stabilizes without reaching, the field reorganizes without delay. Not because it decided to respond, but because the reflection changed. This is the reversal that ends effort. You do not ask the mirror to change. You stop distorting the image. Realization is not an addition to contact. It is what happens when the framework that made contact seem necessary dissolves. Up until this point, contact appeared as a phase because perception still carried a subtle sense of separation. There was awareness here and a field there. Even if that distance felt thin, it still structured the experience. Realization begins when that structure collapses. Contact exists only while separation is assumed. It is the bridge perception builds when it believes there is a gap. When coherence stabilizes deeply enough, that gap is seen to be conceptual rather than real. At that moment, contact does not deepen. It ends. Not because access is lost, but because there is no longer anything to access. This is why realization can feel anticlimactic. There is no event marking the transition. No announcement. No peak. The system simply stops orienting towards something outside itself. Awareness recognizes that what it was perceiving as the field was never separate from perception itself. The subject-object split dissolves quietly. When separation dissolves, the idea of contact becomes unnecessary. There is no longer a perceiver registering something external. There is just perception happening as itself. The field does not disappear. It becomes indistinguishable from awareness. What once felt like being in contact now feels like being at home. This is often misunderstood as losing something. The mind expects realization to feel bigger, clearer, or more powerful. Instead, it feels simpler. Less defined. Less dramatic. The sense of relationship gives way to a sense of continuity. There is nothing to focus on because nothing is outside. There is nothing to maintain because nothing is being held. In this phase, even the language of coherence becomes secondary. Coherence was the condition that allowed perception to stabilize. Once perception recognizes non-separation, coherence is no longer something to manage. It is implicit. The system is no longer trying to align. It already knows it is not divided. This is also why seeking cannot survive realization. Seeking requires distance. Distance requires separation. When separation dissolves, the impulse to reach collapses. Not because answers were found, but because the question no longer makes sense. There is nowhere to go and nothing to attain. Contact was never the destination. It was a transitional perception that pointed toward this recognition. Once recognition occurs, contact has served its function. It dissolves naturally, without effort, without ceremony. The system does not move on. It simply stops referencing an old map. Nothing mystical replaces it. Daily life continues. Thoughts arise. Emotions move. Decisions happen. But they occur within a different context. Not a context of connection, but a context of continuity. Reality is no longer experienced as something you interface with. It is experienced as what is happening. So understand this clearly. Contact ends not because coherence fails, but because coherence succeeds. When non-separation is recognized, the bridge is no longer needed. Awareness no longer reaches. It rests as itself. Quietly. Ordinarily. Completely. When coherence is stable, seeking ends without effort. Not because a goal was reached, but because the internal movement that required a goal dissolves. The system no longer feels the need to scan, correct, or improve its position. Vigilance relaxes. Maintenance becomes unnecessary. What remains is a quiet neutrality that is often mistaken for emptiness, but is actually completeness. Seeking was never about answers. It was about instability. When coherence fluctuates, perception looks outward for resolution. It searches for confirmation, meaning, or reassurance. That outward motion feels purposeful, but it is compensatory. It exists only because internal agreement has not yet settled. When coherence stabilizes, the compensatory loop shuts down naturally. This state is not passive in the sense of disengagement. Life continues. Actions still occur. Decisions are still made. But they are no longer driven by the need to fix perception. There is no background anxiety pushing movement. No subtle pressure to maintain access or protect clarity. Experience unfolds without being monitored. Quiet neutrality does not mean numbness. Sensation remains. Emotion remains. Thought remains. What changes is the absence of urgency. Experience no longer needs to be interpreted to be valid. Nothing needs to be extracted from the moment. The system is no longer asking whether it is aligned. That question only arises when alignment is unstable. Maintenance falls away because there is nothing to maintain. Coherence is no longer a state being held, it is the default condition. Effort was only ever required when interference was present. When interference dissolves, effort has no function. Trying to sustain clarity would now introduce strain, which would be incoherent. This is why the post-contact phase often feels uneventful. The mind expects fireworks or continuous insight. Instead, there is normalcy. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The field is no longer something perceived. It is simply the context in which perception happens. This ordinariness is not regression. It is integration. Vigilance disappears because there is nothing left to guard. The fear of losing access dissolves once it is recognized that access was never something possessed. It was a phase of perception. When that phase resolves into non-separation, loss is no longer possible. What remains cannot be taken away because it was never added. This state can feel unfamiliar at first. The absence of seeking may feel like a lack of direction. But this is only because direction was previously supplied by desire and correction. When those dissolve, action arises from clarity instead. Movement becomes simpler. Decisions feel quieter. There is less internal debate because there is less internal division. Nothing needs to be claimed in this state. No identity needs to be reinforced. The system is no longer orienting around becoming or maintaining. It is simply functioning. Coherence expresses itself as ease, not as achievement. So understand this precisely. Seeking does not stop because something was found. It stops because coherence no longer requires compensation. Vigilance dissolves because there is nothing to protect. Maintenance ends because nothing is being held together artificially. What remains is not a state to preserve, but a neutrality that allows life to move without resistance. Coherence does not require attention to continue. Attention was only needed while interference was present. Once interference dissolves, coherence sustains itself naturally, the same way balance sustains itself once tension stops pulling a system out of alignment. There is nothing to monitor because nothing is being held together artificially. This is the final reversal. Most people assume clarity must be maintained through focus, repetition, or discipline. But attention is a tool, not a foundation. When attention is used to maintain coherence, it introduces effort. Effort introduces control. Control fragments coherence. The attempt to sustain clarity becomes the very thing that disrupts it. When coherence is genuine, it does not depend on awareness checking in on itself. It persists because there is no internal contradiction pulling it apart. Emotion is not fighting attention. Identity is not defending itself. The nervous system is not bracing. In the absence of opposition, coherence remains by default. This is why contact no longer needs to be referenced. Contact was a name given to a phase where perception noticed continuity after a long period of fragmentation. Once perception stabilizes fully, that reference becomes unnecessary. You do not keep naming something that has become the background. You stop pointing at it because there is nowhere else to point. Attention can now move freely without collapsing coherence. Thought can arise. Emotion can shift. Activity can increase or decrease. None of this disrupts stability because coherence is no longer dependent on stillness or focus. It is structural. It does not require protection. This is also why trying to return to contact is meaningless at this stage. There is nothing to return to. The phase resolved. The system no longer orients around access. It orients around function. Life continues without metaphysical commentary. Reality does not need to be interpreted to be valid. Coherence expresses itself now as simplicity. Less internal dialogue. Less self-reference. Less checking. Decisions feel quieter because they are not negotiated between conflicting parts. Action arises without narrative. Rest occurs without justification. Nothing is being optimized. This does not mean awareness fades. It becomes ordinary. Integrated. Like gravity. Always present, rarely noticed. The mistake would be to think something is missing because nothing is highlighted anymore. Nothing needs to be highlighted. The system is no longer signaling itself. This is why attention is free again. It can engage, explore, create, or rest without destabilizing the system. Coherence is not lost when attention wanders because attention is no longer the stabilizing factor. Agreement is. Contact was never meant to be permanent as a concept. It was a bridge. Once crossed, you do not carry the bridge with you. You walk on solid ground without referencing how you arrived. So understand this clearly. Coherence continues without attention because it no longer depends on correction. Contact dissolves because it is no longer needed as a reference. What remains is not a state to maintain, but a condition that sustains itself. If you are aligned with this recognition, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it.